So here's a presentation called What is a Country? You would think that that would not be a controversial or difficult question to answer, but as you'll see in the 30 slides or so I've got to show you, that it's not very clear actually. So here we have a map of the world, which you will notice is a physical map of the world, and there are no borders shown. So we're going to try to answer the question, what is a country? Okay, the first thing to notice is that this presentation is not complete. I went through I have an Excel spreadsheet that has a whole bunch of information for every country listed in Scots, and I was going through it to check, and I discovered there are all sorts of examples and cases where I had not reported what I had to say about them, and there were just too many of them to actually try to do a complete thing. So mostly what you're going to get here is examples, or in some cases you get everything that's relevant. I'll say let's ask about the country name first of all. What is the name of a country? It is not necessarily the name that's on the stamp. We know very well that Great Britain was authorized to never put the name of the country on the stamp, although they did once. And there are a number of other countries. If you're looking at the identifier at the back of the Scott catalogs, you'll see a bunch of cases where there's no country name on the stamp, but mostly there's a country name of some kind. But is it the name of the country in the language of the country, or is it the name in English? Does Germany really be Deutschland? If it doesn't use Latin characters, there's different ways to transcribe them and so on. And of course, most of the catalogs use whatever they think the local name of that country would be in their own language. In some cases, the country has a particularly larger name than it's generally known as. For example, Danzig, we know as Danzig, but on the stamps, it says Free State, Danzig Free State on them. Now, if the country changes just its name, is it the same country? The stamps for what is listed as Somalia start out with the name Benadir on them. They then changed to Italian Somalia. And then when the country became independent, it became Somalia. But Scott, even in this classic catalog where Somalia never existed, they list all of those stamps as Somalia. British Central Africa merely changed its name to Nyasaland Protectorate. And in that case, instead of having them all lumped together under one listing, there are two separate listings for them. But if it also changes the border as well as changing its name, are there two listings? And we know, for example, that the Russian Empire had a different border than the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation has yet another border, but they're all listed under Russia. If it radically changes its border, does it keep the same name? And here's the two big things I have to pick with Scott, and I'll get some more detail on that later. But Austria starts out as the listings for Austria, I believe, and then it basically is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then later on, when that fell apart after World War I, it's the listings for the Republic of Austria, which is a very different entity. And the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, all listed under Turkey, is an even larger case. And that's one of the particular things I will comment on later. Okay, let's forget about what you want to call it, but what is really a country? Is it a geographical area? As we've noted before, a country changes its borders and keeps its name. Is it a state? That is it a government? But what about if a particular government essentially is owned by another country? For example, colonies are not countries in a sense because they're not independent. Some other country owns them. And is the various categories of colonies, is a protectorate a different thing than a colony? What if the type of government in a country changes? There's the Empire of Brazil and there's the Republic of Brazil. Are they the same place? Russia, USSR, the Orange Free State, which is an independent country, versus Orange River Colony. Scott lists all the stamps for that as Orange River Colony, although most of the stamps are in fact stamps of the Orange Free State. And what do you do if a particular state is torn by a civil war? Russia, Spain, US, there's a whole slide later on that. And Scott does not treat them all the same. So you would think a country, you know, you need catalog numbers. A country starts with number 1. But it turns out that there are some countries, as Scott calls them, which do not have regular stamps. They do not start with number 1. Ushir, Corfu, and Mesopotamia, the stamps for those countries are all N stamps. They're all occupation stamps. How can you have a country that never had any stamps of its own and actually be a country? Now, see, in my opinion, those are mistakes to list those as countries. There are continuation countries that do not start with number 1. The most obvious one and shocking is Italy, which starts with number 17. I'm sure most of you know that Italy's numbers are a continuation of the numbers of Sardinia, which is the country that provided the king of Italy. It's interesting to note that Sardinia no longer has a number 16, but Scott, of course, never changed the numbering of the stamps of Italy to reflect that. And the one that really gores me, as we'll get into later, is Bechuanaland Protectorate. Begins with number 51. We'll see why in a minute. There are even a few countries whose first stamp is number 1A. Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, Moravia, and Fiume. And the reason for this is that they found a stamp after they had listed these countries that was issued before number 1. And the normal rule on these, what I call interpolation suffixes, the capital letters, is that you provide them to put a stamp after another stamp. There's no provision for putting a stamp before another stamp. But for number 1, they put 1A before 1 instead of after 1, so that these two countries start with number 1A. And offices abroad are listed at the end of the country that issued them, but they start with number 1, as do some other sub-countries. For example, Austria, Lombardy, Venetia starts at number 1, and it's not listed as Lombardy, Venetia. It's listed after Austria.
What I'm hearing from you is that based on the way Scott lays out their countries,
Yes,
it's inconsistent on how they define certain things.
that's right. In the Scott Specialized Catalog, there are 541 countries in the sense of a listing that begins with either number 1, 1A, or N1, or with a continuation number. In 2022, a new country was added. You'd think the Classic Specialized, they knew all about all the countries, but no, they took out Czechoslovakia 254B and called it number 1 of Carpatho, Ukraine. They decided somehow that was a real country, which I assure you, Stephen, it was even less of a country than the Confederate States of America. Now, Bechuanaland Protectorate and British Bechuanaland are terrible. They're listed, both of them are listed as Bechuanaland. However, British Bechuanaland was the southern part of the area that the Bechuana people lived in, which was later annexed to the Cape of Good Hope. And Bechuana Protectorate was north of British Bechuanaland, later became Botswana. They were completely geographically separate entities, but they're listed under the same name in Scott, and that's why the numbers continue. But you have stamps that were issued for British Bechuanaland, and later stamps of a different geographical entity north of British Bechuanaland were issued, and they continued the numbers for British Bechuanaland, which makes no sense at all. So that's a terrible, terrible example. And of course, other catalogs, they don't correspond to Scott exactly. They have their own take on these various things. They're usually fairly close, but they're never exactly the same. let's look at some significant name changes. Eastern Romalia is a country according to Scott, but it's peculiar because yes, Eastern Romalia existed. It was a province of the Ottoman Empire. But when it started issuing stamps, it was stamps issued by the Bulgarians, and they called it South Bulgaria.
No, that's not so, Phil. There
No?
were stamps issued by the Ottomans for Eastern Rumelia. It's the same territory that later became South Bulgaria, but there were Ottoman stamps that are inscribed Eastern Rumelia.
Okay, I'll have to fix that. Transjordan. Do anybody know why Transjordan and why 1949 is an interesting date?
I think
correct.
that was once upon a time, the Palestine Mandate encompassed both what was known as Palestine. It later, they split it down the Jordan River, and I believe they gave part of the Palestine Mandate to the Hashmonite Kingdom of Jordan, to Abdullah, and called it Transjordan, meaning across the Jordan River, as
Well, the
opposed to
Hashemite-
the other part that remained Palestine.
The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is a later name for this area. You're right. The Palestine Mandate was split in two, and the part that was Transjordan on the eastern side of the Jordan River was given to the Hashemites, and the stamps say Transjordan. And then after the Israeli War of Independence, and the Jordanians occupied what we now know as the West Bank, it was no longer Transjordan. So then they changed the stamp to say the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Race settlements became part of Malaya, changed its name. The stamps of Curacao, which say Curacao on them, are listed by Scott as Netherlands Antilles. However, the stamps of Suriname, which is Netherlands Guinea, are listed under Suriname. Why? There are no stamps issued bearing the name Belgian East Africa, but it's called Rwanda Urundi, even though that was the name initially. We've already mentioned Benadir on the early stamps. And then there are just some name changes. In the old stamp album I have, the stamps of Ethiopia are listed as Abyssinia because they used to, in English, refer to that area as Abyssinia. Persia became Iran, Siam became Thailand. There are several other examples of this, I believe. Now, there's this peculiar thing in Scott called states. And there are four sets of countries that are not listed under their own names directly. They're listed as something states and then the name. So you have Australian states. For example, New South Wales is listed under Australian states, New South Wales, before Australia itself. Canadian provinces, German states, and Italian states. And why Canadian provinces are called provinces rather than states, because they were independent colonies before the Dominion of Canada was formed. I don't know. Scott prefers to do that. There are a bunch of other dominions that are listed in the introductory material in the catalog. For example, they mention New Zealand and India and South Africa, but those countries, dominions, are not treated the same way as these particular countries are. Why?
Bill, how do you define a dominion? I've never understood.
I suspect that's an actual term of law in British law. It's a special category. You'll see that the ones that they're focusing on here are all white settler colonies in which the natives were completely overrun.
Dominion might imply a certain degree of home rule.
Yes, they were given, when the dominions were created, they were given more home rule than they had as individual colonies. Yes, that's one of the things that happened. And for two of these, for Germany and Italy, not only were there German states that united to form Germany, but they annexed various other countries. In Germany, Allenstein, Danzig, Heligoland became part of Germany itself. The point here is that Scott has given special treatment to certain entities. For
Hmm.
example, a crown colony, New South Wales, which they combine together. And there are other parts that belong, for example, to Germany or Italy, that they do not give the same treatment to. My own preference would have been to treat them in the way that they actually existed historically. In fact, most dealers who carry, for example, Newfoundland stamps, they're not in their boxes under C for Canada. They're under N for Newfoundland. These unions of things to make Australia or Canada or Germany or Italy are historically important, and they involve large numbers of people and large amounts of territory and power and so on, so that they're given special treatment. Also, partly, I suspect, because of collectors who would like to buy, for example, the A volume of the catalog only, because they only collect Australia and things that became part of Australia, and they don't want to buy all 6 volumes of the catalog. No, but there's a bunch of other states that could be states in the same sense. For Argentina, you have these 3 parts of Argentina that were listed separately after Argentina proper, but they could have been called Argentinian states and listed before Argentina. The Azores, the Portuguese issued stamps for some of the different islands and areas on the islands instead of for the Azores as a whole. Colombia, which was in a previous presentation I did, some of these states issued stamps before Colombia issued stamps. And in fact, Colombia was a federation of these countries originally. Why aren't they listed as Colombian states? They're listed after Colombia. Comoro Islands, many of the individual islands issued stamps. Costa Rica had Guanacaste. India, not quite the same thing as the Italian states that came together to form Italy, but certainly they were states of Indian states. They're listed after India. Indochina, several stamp issuing entities were put together to form Indochina. They're not listed as Indo-Chinese states. Libya, Madagascar. Here, Mozambique is the worst one in my opinion, because there were these 8 stamp issuing entities that were put together to form Mozambique. You had a bunch of states put together to form Australia. Why is Mozambique treated differently than Australia? Certainly, people who collect Mozambique would like to have everything listed under M for Mozambique.
Is it a
Nigeria,
question of volume?
don't know. I think they treat British differently. Remember, the catalog used to have British Commonwealth as a separate heading. You had the United States, United Nations, then British Commonwealth, then the rest of the world before they moved the British Commonwealth into the rest of the world. So they always treated Britain specially. South Africa, my own area of initial collection, clearly you would like to have all of these entities that later became part of South Africa listed together with South Africa, but they haven't done it. Spanish Guinea, Venezuela, Yugoslavia, all of these things, you could make the same argument you could make for Australia or Canada or Germany or Italy, that they should be listed together with their original, their later entity. Then there are a whole bunch of things like what I listed for Germany that people wanted to argue about. These are not particularly states, but these are former stamp issuing entities that were later in whole or in part annexed to another country. So you have Albania that took Epirus and Salsano, and that list goes on, including the United States with Hawaii. Then there's the mess, which I mentioned in a previous presentation, Malaya, all the different little pieces of Malaya, and the name changes after World War II. That's, what's going on there. And it's not really consistent how it's dealt with. And there were lash-ups and break-ups. British East Africa had a whole bunch of different names. Various pieces were combined in stamps with different names, and then they broke apart again, and then they recombined. And of course, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania shouldn't be listed that way because it's a complete anachronism. It never existed. Tanzania is a particular later lash-up of Zanzibar and Tanganyika. Czechoslovakia had pieces and was several times divided into pieces. French Guiana, Italy, the Aegean Islands were part of Italy for a while, but then not. Now we get to this thing of empires, which I mentioned earlier. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is listed as Austria and Scot. And Lombardy Venetia is listed under Austria at the end of Austria, because in fact, Lombardy Venetia was a possession of the King of Austria, not of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Hungary is not listed as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, although it was part of it, obviously. And Bosnia and Herzegovina has its own country listing. And then after the breakup, it's listed separately as part of Yugoslavia. China is divided into these 7 pieces for some unknown reason. They're not listed as local issues, which is probably what they should be listed as. The Ottoman Empire, we've already mentioned Eastern Rumelia. Mesopotamia is one of the end countries that has nothing but occupation stamps. If you were going to get technical, Mesopotamia should be listed as Ottoman Empire issued under British occupation. You can actually make an argument that the early stamps of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine should be listed the same way, because that was before those countries were officially noted as mandates of these colonial powers. So for a number of years, they were actually British or French occupations of the Ottoman Empire. So the last thing about Ottoman Turkey is this thing called Turkey in Asia, which were stamps issued by the government in Ankara, which controlled most of the area of modern Turkey, while the Ottoman Empire was still in existence and issuing its own stamps. And really, if you're going to list Turkey, it should start with the stamps called Turkey in Asia today. The stamps issued prior to that should be listed as Ottoman Empire. We've had a long presentation about what went on in Russia. All of these countries that are listed here were formerly part of Russia, and then we're independent. We're part of the Soviet Union. We're independent again. And all of those 14 entities that existed briefly during the Russian Civil War, which are listed as countries, and in some cases listed after countries. And 2 of them were just the headquarters of imperial armies. So that counted as a country. Saudi Arabia is not normally thought of as an empire, but from a philatelic point of view, it is, because the original stamps for Saudi Arabia were issued as 2 countries: Nejd, which was the homeland of the Saudis, and Hejaz, which was a stamp issuing entity under the Hashemites for a time. And then briefly on the stamps in 1926, after Nejd conquered Hejaz, it was called the Hejazi Nejd Kingdom. So that's a modern empire, unlike the Russian or Austro-Hungarian empires. It's an empire that came into creation after the period in which stamps were being issued. We've mentioned Carpatho-Ukraine. You can talk about Eastern Silesia, became part of Czechoslovakia and Poland. There were stamps issued as French colonies, which were used in all of the French colonies before the individual colonies issued stamps. And of course, and more recently, the Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We should also mention that there are countries that unified after 1940. There was the United Arab Republic for a while. And of course, current day Yemen is the unification of South Yemen and Yemen. So the reverse happens as well. How do you handle these philatelically? Offices abroad are listed after the ruling, the issuing country. And it's strange, I just note this is not really a big point to pick, but some of them are listed using the country's adjectival form. So the Austrian offices abroad are listed as Austrian offices abroad, whereas the French offices abroad use the nominal form, France offices abroad. the thing to note is the Polish offices abroad are listed where all the other offices abroad are listed. They're listed after the country, but it doesn't begin with number 1. It begins with number K1. And as we'll see later, the same is true of the United States offices abroad. Shanghai is listed as a K stamp, but it's not listed as United States offices abroad. It's listed simply where the K stamps would be listed alphabetically. So they're very strange about those two. And then the Romanian post offices abroad are not listed as Romania offices abroad, offices in the Turkish Empire. They're listed under this name, which combines both of those things and doesn't follow the same pattern as everywhere else. And here I say, here you have the United States, is peculiar. The offices in China are listed at type K. And if you're looking through the catalog there, you'll notice it's between the J and O, which is where it belongs. But if you're looking for the JQ stamps, the postage due parcel post, they're not listed alphabetically. They're listed after type Q. There's this strange place called Bangkok. Why is Bangkok an occupation, an office abroad, or a treaty port? That's essentially what it was, but they list it as its own country. There are a bunch of countries that have dual administrations in which 2 occupying countries issued their own stamps. Andorra, French and Spanish, and Madagascar and New Hebrides, British and French. And the United States is treated very peculiarly. This is often the case. The French areas and the German areas are treated peculiarly in the Evertentelier and the Michael catalog. We've already mentioned the Confederate States. We will have a little bit about Civil Wars later, but if you compare what happened with the Confederate States in the United States to what happened in Spain, you get very different histories there, because in the Confederate States, as was pointed out, existed fairly briefly and were then reincorporated in the country from which they had rebelled. In the case of Spain, the initial Spanish stamps were issued by the Republic of Spain, but the rebelling part, the Francoist forces, of course, won that war, and they took over the country of Spain. So how do you do that? When do you switch over? How do you treat the Republican stamps as all like Confederate States? There's something that was sort of illegitimate temporarily. This is the general problem in history, that you write the history of the past with an idea of what's going to happen in the future. You know what the outcome is going to be, so you can treat them a certain way rather than looking at exactly what they were at the time. The Canal Zone stamps issued by the US are listed after the United States, but they were before that and after that, they were part of Panama. So should they really be listed as Panama, issued under United States occupation? Probably. Guam never had its own stamps. Presumably it used the stamps of the Philippines, and it now uses US stamps. Hawaii was annexed by the US. And like the American Virgin Islands, which currently use US stamps, the Danish West Indies are not listed under the United States. But they haven't become a state like Hawaii has, so Hawaii is treated differently. Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico were all obtained by the United States and after the Spanish-American War. And the stamps issued under US occupation are listed as stamps of those countries, not as United States occupation stamps of those countries. And of course, Puerto Rico now uses US stamps like Hawaii and Guam. And there's in the introductory section of the Scott catalog, there are colonies, former colonies, offices, and territories controlled by parent states, which lists the British Empire, the French Empire, and so on and so on. The United States does not receive the same treatment for its territories, I guess because They don't want to admit that the United States was ever a colonial power. Morocco is peculiar. The first stamps listed under Morocco are listed as French Morocco. But in 1912, the local government issued its own stamps. And these are listed as Morocco. And then that listing continues in the modern catalogs with the stamps of Morocco after it was formally granted independence. But at the same time, French Morocco continued to issue stamps until 1956. There are some countries that are not countries. In Austria, there's a listing for the Danube Steam Navigation Company. Starts with number 1, as if it were a country of its own. It's certainly not a country. However, the Suez Canal Company is listed under Egypt, and I think it's probably correct as being a local issue for Egypt. And then there's Czechoslovakia, which we discussed in the presentation on the Russian Civil War. There was this Czechoslovak Legion Post. Arguably could be country. They had possession of certain parts of Russia for a while, but it's really not a country. So, but it's treated as such. Starts with number 1. Civil wars, I've mentioned a few. Mexico had several civil wars, and they're listed under slightly different titles. Their listings began with number 1. However, the rebellious areas of the Philippines, their stamps are not listed as revolutionary issues or civil war issues. They have the type Y. Spain is the most complicated. There was an earlier civil war there, and the Carlist stamps are listed as X-type stamps. And as I said, the Republic issues from 1931 to 39 are listed as Spain. And after 1939, the stamps issued by the Franco people are listed as Spanish stamps. And the earlier issues by the Francoists are listed as local issues. Syria, if you'll remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia, the Syrians, the Hashemites tried to issue their own stamps and run their own government in Syria for a while. And these are listed as Syria Arab government. And again, Turkey, there was a period when both the Ottomans and the government in Ankara were issuing their own stamps. Now, Perugia has provisionals. They're listed, they were issued by local Peruvian authorities when the main cities of Peru were occupied by Chilean troops, but they're listed as occupation stamps, but they're not issued by the occupying authority. They're issued by the original Peruvian government and their local officials. They really should be listed as local stamps. So to conclude, I've made a lot of comments here about the inconsistency of Scott. Is that I am a small mind. The actual quote from Emerson says, "A foolish consistency." So the question is, should Scott deal with this? I should note that I was preparing some of my update pages for my album, and I don't remember whether I mentioned this to Scott, but in any case, they at least noticed that the 2 local issues they had previously put in the catalog for France really should be separate numbers. They were called L1 and L2. In the new catalog, they're called 1L1 and 2L1 because they were issued in different localities in France. So they've actually split up what was just a regular local issue into a more consistent with the other things such as French Morocco locals, where each locality has a preceding number before the L to indicate that it's a different place. So they either caught that themselves or they heard about it from me and they decided to correct it. So that's it.